Tonight we will be joined by Brian Arnold for tonight's Meet the Artist, which we started this series in October of 2022 and have hosted over 150 artists thus far, almost every single night, every single Thursday for the last 3 years. So this series is made possible by a generous grant from the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation. And before I turn over to Brian, I just want to share a bit about his background and many global accolades. Brian Arnold is a photographer, educator, and musician based in Ithaca, New York. He has undergraduate degrees in English and ethnomusicology from the Colorado College and an MFA in photography from the Massachusetts College of Art. His photographs have been exhibited in China, France, Indonesia, Italy, and the US, and are included in a number of important museum and library collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, the George Eastman House in Rochester, the library at Cleveland Museum of Art, the Denver Museum of Art, and the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University, in addition to the National Gallery of Australia, the Indonesian Visual Arts Archive, and late work in Syracuse, New York. He has received a number of important grants and residencies, most recently from the Marco Marulik Foundation, McDowell, the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. Brian has taught and lectured about photography at a number of prestigious institutions in the US and abroad, including at Cornell University, the School of Art and Design at Alfred University, Massachusetts College of Art, the Santa Reparata International College of Art in Florence, Italy, Pasundan University in Bandung, West Java, the Institute of Technology in Bandung, the University of Indonesia, the Indonesian Institute of Art, the National Gallery of Australia, Canberra, and the School of International Training for the Academy of Arts in Novi Sad, Serbia. Anything else I missed? Without further ado, let's welcome Brian Arnold. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. That makes me sound more impressive than I usually feel. And thanks to CPW for having me tonight. And thanks to all of you tuning in online and for being here tonight. I'm really grateful to share some work with you. In recent years, I've developed, I think I've come to this point where I like to introduce myself as an interdisciplinary photographer, in that I've created a practice of photography that includes work as a writer, curator, and image maker. And I want to talk a little bit about how I've developed that kind of practice, and in particular focus on two different parts of the world that have really captured my attention. Before I talk about my own work, I want to talk about some connections that existed before I ever got involved in the places that I've come to photograph. So the title we have here, Bandung to Belgrade. Over the last, for decades, I did work in Indonesia, and Bandung is a city in West Java. And really since 2018, I've had a really great relationship with a small art school in northern Serbia, which is really snowballing into a new project that I'm going to share with you tonight. But I've been really curious, as I've done a lot of research into these different places, to find some really unlikely overlaps. And really the most important of them dates back to 1955, where I guess on your left, the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, staged a conference, which outside of Indonesia is called the Bandung Conference. In Indonesia is called the Asia-Africa Conference. And Sukarno had this really brilliant idea to create something similar to NATO, though composed of post-colonial nations. Right? He had this idea that the newly independent colonized world could be more powerful as a collective. Interestingly enough, so in the picture on the left, you see Sukarno introducing the Bandung Conference. The picture on the right, you might recognize American novelist Richard Wright. whom was very popular with post-colonial novelists in Java. So in that picture, he's actually meeting with a collection of writers from Indonesia. And actually the backstory, so when he first heard of the conference, the Asia-Africa conference, the Bandung conference, Richard Wright was living in Paris, but he knew he had to go to this conference. He loved the vision of it so much, and was able to raise money and become like an American reporter, if not the American reporter of the Bandung conference, never knowing that he went as an agent of the CIA, right? So the CIA funded his whole trip, which I thought was a really great backstory. So the Bandung conference was 1955, and 6 years later, the work of the Bandung conference was ratified as an international treaty in Belgrade, and was called the non-alignment movement, right? So after World War II, a lot of the colonized nations refused to accept the binary construction of post-World War II, Cold War culture, and refused to align themselves with either the capitalist or the communist nations. So in this picture, you see some of the original signatories of the non-alignment treaty, including President Tito on the far right, the president that unified Yugoslavia after World War II, next to Sukarno. And to me, like as somebody who had spent like decades studying Indonesia, like I went to Serbia, and like I was like, wow, I want to kind of see if I can do the same thing over here. I loved that there was a connection that really unified these regions before I got there. And before I delve into the work that I've done in Indonesia, and more recently in Serbia and in the Western Balkans, I actually want to start by talking about a really transformative experience that I had when I was 16. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I went to a really inner city school that had a lot of problems with gang violence, and decided at that time, or I was presented with the opportunity at that time to spend a summer studying in Europe, where we collaborated with two different schools, one from Salt Lake City, which was a group of Mormon students for the most part, and another was an all-girls Catholic school from Michigan. And that's really significant to me and the narrative I'm sharing with you tonight. Largely, like I was raised secular humanist, so to be around like these religious students was really, I was like a fish out of water. And then going to Europe and going to the Vatican and going to Chartres Cathedral and all of those things, like this was the first time in my life that I ever really thought about religion. And it was also really the first time in my life I went to museums, right? So the time that I was growing up in Denver, like I was involved as a teenager kind of in this underground art scene where like all the shows I went to were in warehouses and nightclubs and things like that. I never really saw like real art, so to speak. And it's actually Dubuffet is one of the painters at that particular time that just like totally blew my mind. Like I had no idea that art could be at one time so sophisticated and so raw. So what we're looking at here is actually the Vatican and a Dubuffet painting. But I think what's significant about that is for years, the ideas of art and religion became really intertwined to me. They became kind of one and the same question. And I really struggled with that for a long time. Like as somebody who was never raised with a religious identity, I left Europe with a lot of questions about this. Like all these Catholics and Mormons were asking me about it every day. And I came home and I like just kind of delved into all of this, but also started kind of making things and writing and using that as part of that process of reflection. And I think that that idea of those two things together, art and religion, became a little bit more resolved in my mind 6 years later in 1992 when I went to Indonesia for the first time. During that first trip, like as a music minor in college, I went to study Balinese classical music, Balinese gamelan. If you've never heard it, it's really, really incredible music. But what I found when I was there was much more substantial to me than the music that I learned. And I became totally fascinated with Balinese Hinduism And that's largely because it is completely inseparable from creative practice. Art is kind of how you manifest religious belief. And I mean, really, to this day, you find more artists per capita in Bali than any place else. The image on the right is actually one of my favorite painters. It's this Balinese painter named I Gusti Nyoman Lempad. He was both a Hindu mystic and a really accomplished artist. He lived to be 116 and prophesied his own death. But like what was really important for me at that time is to see kind of like these really incredible creative practices that were kind of manifest daily and were always done in pursuit of a particular kind of religious or spiritual ideology. And when I left Indonesia in 1992, I can really say quite truthfully that Indonesia, and particularly some of the ideas I learned in Bali, remained deeply intertwined in my creative practice. And really for decades, I maintained two kind of parallel but totally distinct kind of creative identities. And I worked with some different nonprofits in Colorado and in New York that were designed to create artistic collaborations between the United States and Indonesia. But for me, that was a way to maintain access to the music. And performing and studying gamelan was a really huge part of my life. And I'm pleased to say that I performed places like Lincoln Center and the University of Wyoming, and even places in Bali and Java. And all the while, I'm developing a practice as a photographer, right? And it was really almost 20 years after I left Indonesia that it kind of came to me like, oh my God, like, why don't I just do these things together? And in 2011, I got the first of a series of grants to put some work together in Indonesia. And it was a really kind of a small grant. I was just there for about 6 weeks. But I came back and a number of really important things happened with my work right after that really changed the direction of what I was going to do as a photographer. The first thing I did with those pictures, like I'm not going to go and not make photographs. And I didn't know if it was going to be like a substantial body of work. So I tried like making my first small handmade book at that time. And that actually proved to be kind of a catalyst for things because some of these first books found ways into museums around the country, specifically the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Eastman Museum. So that's what you're looking at on the left. And it wasn't too long after I returned in 2011 that I connected with the Southeast Asia program at Cornell University, which is actually kind of a big deal for good and or ill. Cornell has the largest Indonesian language library holdings in the world, like bigger than anything in Indonesia. But I also like suddenly found access to like these incredible photographic archives and research archives about Indonesia and about Southeast Asia. And as I started developing kind of this research practice, I was keeping a blog online, like back in the day when we did those things. It's all social media now. And I ended up being contacted by this curator at the National Gallery of Australia, Gail Newton, who at that time was putting together what is to date the largest exhibition of colonial era photography about Indonesia, which was at the National Gallery of Australia in 2014. And she actually kind of solicited me to be a consultant and kind of a research assistant with this exhibition. So like those two things together like really made me feel that I had found something significant, right? So the picture you're looking at on the right is an ambrotype of one of the sultans of the Yogyakarta court in central Java that was included in the exhibition that she put together in Canberra. And like this first grant kind of seeded some other grants, which I'll talk about in just 1 minute, but like before, like I got really more fully immersed in Indonesia, like another really unexpected opportunity came my way. And I was solicited by Oxford University Press to write like a technical book on photography. And my initial response was to be kind of dismissive. I never thought I was like that kind of photographer. And as somebody who's largely self-taught in the mechanics of photography, like I felt like a little out of my depths in doing it. But it paid really well. And I also thought like it would be great to learn how to put a book together. And for that, this was a really fantastic project for me because I learned what the kind of networking it took, the kind of collaborative effort putting a book like this together is. So I wrote this book, like those of you who are really involved in photography probably know the Christopher James book, the Book of Alternative Photographic Processes. And this book is amazing, and there's no way that I could ever do anything to compete with it. But Oxford wanted to make something that sold for less money than that, so they asked me to do it. I used to do a lot of handmade photographic processes, which is what you're looking at on the right. And actually, when I was teaching in Alfred, that was a really large part of the curriculum, or my contribution to the curriculum. In 2014, I got the biggest of the grants that I got to put this work together, which was from the Henry Luce Foundation, collaboratively with the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. And I went over to Java, Bali and Java and Lombok for 6 months. I spent most of that time in Yogyakarta in central Java, which you might know of from Borobudur, the great Buddhist monument. So I spent most of my time in Yogyakarta and Bandung, which is where the Institute of Technology in Bandung is, which is a really great art college. And I taught at various schools in Jogja and Bandung, which was really incredible. Like meeting students from like I was working in Islamic institutions, I was working in like these really radical art schools, and just getting a really incredible cross-section on photographic education and kind of photography and popular culture, meeting some of like the first kind of like fine art photographers to emerge in Indonesia. At that time, like fine art photography is kind of a brand new thing. This actually happened to be the very first photograph I made on that trip, and it was during a totally harrowing boat ride between Bali and Lombok. But like I really feel like the research that I was doing at that time started when I got to Yogyakarta. So if you know, I'll assume you don't know too much about Indonesian history. Not many Americans do. So in Java, in central Java, you had two royal families, one in Surakarta and one in Yogyakarta. Yogyakarta being just about an hour south of Surakarta. And when the Dutch came onto the scene, when they colonized Indonesia, they had this kind of divide and conquer approach to the royal family. And part of like how they appeased them is like kind of challenging them and encouraging them to explore their wealth and culture. And the royal patronage in Surakarta and Jogja kind of got like in this war as to who could kind of create the best Indonesian art. And the way that it kind of trickled down in the late 19th and early 20th century is Surakarta became the city for music and dance, and Jogja became the city for visual arts, right? So going to teach in Yogyakarta was totally amazing. Like there are no graffiti laws in Jogja, so like murals are everywhere. It's really incredible. It's like one of the most visually intoxicating cities I've ever been in. And the day that I arrived in Jogja was like totally amazing. There was a huge volcanic eruption in East Java, several hours from Jogja. But the way the winds were blowing, Jogja was covered in ash, and like the airport and access to the city was shut down for like 2 or 3 weeks. And it reopened the day that I arrived. And about an hour after I arrived, it started pouring rain, and like people were just like out in the streets, like celebrating this opportunity to wash all of the ash away, which is actually when I stumbled upon this closed photo lab. So I really just spent those days, like I would meet curators when I could, I would meet publishers when I could, I would meet photographers and do studio visits when I could. I was lecturing at the Institute Seni Indonesia, which is the Indonesian Academy of Art. I was teaching at the University of Islam in Yogyakarta. And just walking the city and making pictures while I was in between those activities. First time I photographed in color. 2014 was a totally incredible time to be in Java. Again, like you might have a basic understanding of Indonesian history in that after World War II, they had President Sukarno for 20 years, and then he was ousted by President Suharto, who took reins for 35 years. And in 1998, he was overthrown in a student revolution, a pro-democracy revolution. And in 2014, when I was there, they had their first public elections. It was totally amazing. So what you're looking at on the right actually is election posters. Kind of done more in a punk rock, kind of anti-government, anti-establishment fashion. So these are some more pictures I made that year. This is actually sugarcane, a controlled burn in a sugarcane field. Sugarcane's a huge colonial era crop. Wasn't a natural crop in Indonesia. The Dutch brought it in. And when I got back from that grant, so the American Institute for Indonesian Studies is kind of loosely funded by the Luce Foundation and loosely funded by the State Department, the United States State Department, probably gonna be 86th in today's day and age. But it also was housed at that time at Cornell University because of the Southeast Asia program that I had there. So when I got back, the person who was running the American Institute for Indonesian Studies read my report, and she gave it to this art historian at Cornell who does work in Southeast Asia. And based on what I accomplished in the 6 months I was there, I was offered a 3-year fellowship to develop an exhibition or a series of 3 exhibitions and a book about contemporary photography in Java. So what you're seeing on the left is the first book that I wrote about photography in Indonesia, which was done collaboratively with a publisher in Jakarta and the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell. As I said, like this exhibition was actually 3 exhibitions. And actually one of the great honors of my life is this exhibition was purposefully timed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of a book called Art in Indonesia, Continuities and Change, written by this woman named Claire Holt, which is still the definitive English language kind of art historical survey of Indonesia, and is even taught in Indonesia, right? So part of the exhibition included Claire Holt's research photographs, which is what we're looking at on the right. Part of the exhibition included my own photographs, right, which we see here. And then the show, like the bulk of the show, focused on 10 photographers that I ended up working with while I was there on that fellowship. And it was really kind of grounded on this idea like of an identity crisis. So all of the photographers were looking either at private life or looking at something about kind of a socialization process, like whether it was Islam or another kind of powerful cultural bloc or tool like that, and trying to ask kind of like pointed or critical questions or more poetic questions, as we're seeing on the left. So the whole thing included 10 different photographers, really all from Yogyakarta, Bandung, and Jakarta. These are 2 of my favorite photographers that were included in the exhibition. Henry Chus Napit Sunargo, who's from Bandung, trained as an architect, self-taught photographer, did this really poetic work about his family. And then the picture on the right is this he's called like one of the first fine art photographers in Indonesia. I can talk more about that later if you have questions, but I'll kind of skip over that for now. But he's like really funny and does these really kind of critical things about historical Javanese culture. So this particular image is made on a really famous beach and kind of playing with some tropes of Islam and some other things about masking female identity. And this is from the pictures of mine that were included in that exhibition. So during these 3 years I was at Cornell in the Southeast Asia program with this fellowship, I was able to piece together a couple of more small grants. And perhaps more importantly, at that particular time, like even before the exhibition, I started to seed this idea in my mind of writing a more comprehensive history of photography in Indonesia. And after I finished this exhibition at Cornell, like I really started to dig into that. But I also knew that like I have an MFA, I'm not like a trained researcher. I didn't have like the research budget to be spending time in Indonesia or the Netherlands or Australia. But also like at Cornell, like I met like some of the most notable Indonesian studies scholars in the world. And much to my surprise, I started writing all these people and said, like, I really want to do a history of photography in Indonesia, but rather than writing it myself, I kind of want to piece it together in a series of essays where you can write on your specialty, or if I can get permission to publish something that you published in the past, something like that. And through that, put together what I think is a pretty comprehensive history of photography. In 2018, I got another small grant from APHIS to really do a lot of the work to solidify that project. And again, like I went over there to do this research, to write about photography in Indonesia, but also used it as an opportunity to grow my own kind of photographic inquiry into Indonesia. And I put together another small book from that trip. So this was all photographed over about 5 or 6 weeks. The book is called Notes Inside the Soft Machine, and it's one of the first kind of text image pieces that I did. I actually have a copy of this if you want to look at it. It's just kind of a small self-printed zine. But it's really the only thing that I've done or produced photographically that's attempting to look at that kind of religious inquiry that I equate with the work that I've done in Indonesia. So what you're looking at here is actually an entry into a pesantren, an Indonesian boarding school in West Java, with a quote from William Burroughs. The whole title of the book comes from this book that William Burroughs wrote called The Soft Machine. This particular book was also one of the first times that I started probing my own archives. Like I think, like when I was in graduate school, I was taught that I was taught photography with a capital P, you know what I mean? So that like I had to like go out and make art and like make these fine prints, and I went to mass art, so I had to work with a view camera. And I kind of started to shed those beliefs and started working with things that I found in flea markets and snapshots I made in 1992 when I was a student. So that was really one of the first projects I put together of my own work that included kind of like archival photographs in conjunction with my more kind of intentional photographs. And now what I want to do is talk to you a little bit more about the book that I put together. I have copies of it here, but I ended up it was published in 2022, this book called The History of Photography in Indonesia, From the Colonial Era to the Digital Age. The book is 19 chapters. I wrote 6 of them, translated 3 of them from Indonesian into English, and worked with writers from Indonesia, the Netherlands, Australia, Romania, and the United States to fill out the rest. As I said, some of the articles or some of the chapters were written on commission, where I would go to people that I knew and say, like, I have this hole in this narrative and I know that you know something about it, can you do that? Or other times I would just get permission to publish things that had been published in the past. I think this book is the first of its kind. I think it is, to date, really the most comprehensive book about photography in Indonesia. And I know that it's the only one published thus far that includes photographs from the 4 biggest photographic archives about Indonesia, which would be Perpustakaan Nasional, the National Library of Indonesia, the National Gallery of Australia, Leiden University, and Cornell University. So I pulled out, just for this talk, some of my favorite pictures or some of my favorite photographers from the book. So what you're looking at on the left is a work by this guy named Kasian Chepas, who's the first known photographer of Javanese descent. He was really active starting right around 1860, 1870, and worked into the early 20th century. He became the staff photographer for the royal court in Yogyakarta. The picture on the right is a daguerreotype. The Dutch colonial government was the first of the European powers to commissioned photographers to go photograph what they were doing. They sent a couple of daguerreotypists over there as early as 1840, and it was a total disaster. Like, we only know those daguerreotypes from written records. None of them were preserved. So they had this idea, like they had this German photographer living in Amsterdam at the time. They sent him over to study daguerreotyping with Jean-Louis Daguerre, and then sent him to Indonesia to photograph the Hindu Buddhist monuments. So what you're looking at is a daguerreotype of a Balinese temple mask. Two of my favorite people who picture or who feature in the book, both were a huge influence on me. The first on the left is a photograph by this guy named Walter Spies, who was a German man who spent most of his teenage and early adult years in Russia and traveled to Indonesia and spent the rest of his life there until he was imprisoned by the Japanese during World War II. But he is often cited as, I mentioned when I showed you this picture by Igusti Nyoman Limpad, the painting. In early 20th century Bali, after World War I, there was this incredible time in, I think, global painting and global art history. And Walter Spies was a really large part of that. He was one of the first people to bring oil paints into Indonesia. And also, much more importantly, he ended up getting a villa just outside of Ubud. If any of you have been to Bali, you've probably been to Ubud. It's a part of the island that's really well known for the visual arts. And he kind of created a critique group where he would invite painters from all of the neighboring villages, and they'd all get together and share ideas and learn how to use oil paints together and whatnot. He also became the person who, he was kind of the contact person for anybody coming from the West who wanted to see Bali or Indonesia. So he's famous for bringing Charlie Chaplin around Bali. Margaret Mead, people like that were first introduced to Indonesia through Walter Spies. What I identify with or like about Walter Spies is he was kind of this gay expatriate who never found a home in Europe and found one in Bali. Neither being gay nor an expatriate, I still identify with this idea that he found more commonality in this culture that seems so different to him. He also put together a really great book of photographs called Dance and Drama in Bali, where he documented different mask dance traditions around the island. The picture on the right is again by Claire Holt, who I mentioned when I was talking about the exhibition at the Johnson Museum. To read Claire Holt's archives, I didn't mention enough about this when I was talking about my time at Cornell, but one of, I think, a really pivotal part of my whole connection to Indonesia was reading Claire Holt's archives. So I mentioned in 1967, she published this really incredible book called Art in Indonesia, Continuities and Change, which really looks at art in the archipelago from the Middle Ages to independence to about 1950. And it's this really incredible thing. And she's so highly regarded in Indonesian art education. Her book is taught in art academies in Indonesia. And to go and look at all of her research notes and her pictures and whatnot was so amazing, because it made the whole idea of doing something like this tangible, right? Because you can see her wrestling with depression. You see the correspondence she had with this married man she was having an affair with in Java, and all of these things. It made this incredible accomplishment really human and obtainable to me. This particular photograph is actually a photograph of one of the most famous painters to come from Java, the guy who's sitting in the window on the left. His name is Effendi. He's often called the Van Gogh of Indonesia. He made these really incredible kind of improvised portraits that are just really dissonant and expressive and beautiful. A couple of other photographers I really loved learning more about putting this together. On the left is a photograph by this guy named Caspar Thuis, who was a Dutch photographer. Before World War II, he worked for these leftist proletariat magazines in the Netherlands. During World War II, he was imprisoned by the Nazis and used his skills as a photographer to help make fake IDs to smuggle people out of occupied territories. After World War II, he went to Indonesia and put together this incredible book, just over a couple of months photographing, called In Staten Verding. I might be pronouncing that wrong, I never really studied Dutch. But it translates as a state in the making. And what he saw was like the independence movement. So Indonesia got their independence from the Dutch in 1947. He was photographing before that, probably 1946. But he fully embraced this idea that the colonization had to end, and did this really incredible manifesto of it in photographs. The picture on the right is Henri Cartier-Bresson. A lot of people don't know he was married to a Javanese woman. When he was imprisoned by the Nazis, his wife sent him an Indonesian language dictionary so they could correspond without the Nazis knowing what they were writing about. Like Cas Orthus, he went to Indonesia after World War II, and again became another voice in Europe calling for an end of colonization. I think personally, like as somebody who studied a lot of the history of photography, I think this is one of the most important photographs of the 20th century. So Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for most of the 19th century and until 1947. In 1945, during World War II, the Japanese came in, they ran the Dutch out, and they took over the archipelago. Originally, the Indonesians were like, great, they're like us, we have the same skin color, this is going to be a great change for us. The Japanese proved to be even worse than the Dutch. And during the Japanese occupation, you started to see an independence movement materialize, kind of like the first organized political figures emerging in what became Indonesia, coming out and calling for an end of colonization. The person who really led that movement was Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, who we're seeing here. Technically, Indonesia gained their independence in 1947, though the Indonesian version of the 4th of July, Indonesian Independence Day, is August 17th, 1945, when Sukarno held this press conference at his house in Java, where he rallied officials together because he wanted to make like some bold statement. The Japanese heard about this, so they tried to police what was going on. And there were two Javanese photographers there, brothers named Franz and Alex Mendour. During this presentation, Sukarno said, we no longer recognize the legitimacy of a foreign government. Today, Indonesia is a free nation, right? The Japanese saw these two Javanese photographers there, and they didn't want the pictures to get out. They didn't want anybody to know that Indonesia just declared their freedom. They managed to confiscate the film of one of these photographers. The other smuggled his film out. He buried it outside his compound, his house, for a week or two until he thought it was safe. He developed it and posted it on International Newswire, declaring Indonesia a free nation. And I love that because to me, this is the purest example of photographic revolution that I know of, right? Like it's like what cojones this guy had to go to Reuters and post this photograph. Another like really great experience in putting this book together is working with this guy named Oscar Matolo. So I mentioned that art education or photographic education in Indonesia is a very new thing, right? It kind of emerged around the mid-1990s. Like if you think of like when the Bauhaus started teaching photography or kind of like when it emerged in American art schools, that's like a huge delay. And prior to that, there was really only one photographic gallery, archive, and kind of workshop center in Jakarta called the Photojournalistic Gallery of Antara, which you're seeing their headquarters on the left. And this was all run by this news photographer named Oscar Matolo. And I was working with Oscar for a long time to try and create to write a history of this agency that he put together, this workshop, gallery, and archive. And it proved to be really difficult. He said he really wanted to do it. I was like, oh, yeah, and he never did it. And eventually he sent me this lecture that he gave at some art academy in Java about the founding of this organization and how it lasted over the years. And he gave that to me in Indonesian, and I translated that to English. And then together with his assistant, who knows some English, we were able to shape that to read like an essay. So These are from a chapter in the book that documents the history of this organization. So on the left, you're seeing their headquarters. On the right, you're seeing an exhibition they put together about the independence movement in 1998 called Reformasi. These are just more pictures from that chapter. So the picture on the left is actually a leader of the East Timorese independence movement. So shortly after the authoritarian government of Indonesia collapsed, East Timor went for their independence. And a lot of Indonesia was opposed to that, but the Gallery of Antara sent photographers over there to document it. They were in support of Timorese independence. The picture on the right is actually one of Oscar Matolo's photographs of the tsunami in Aceh in 2004. Two of my favorite people that feature in this book, on the left is this anthropologist who teaches at CUNY Queens in New York, named Karen Strassler, who's written 2 books about photography and media in Indonesia. Karen Strassler is like really popular in Indonesian, Southeast Asian studies, but I really want more photographers to read her work. She has incredible ideas about photography and politics and photography in the mass media. Her chapter in this book is about photography and democracy. So in 1998, the Indonesian authoritarian government was overthrown by a student revolution, and photography played a huge role in that. And people really thought photography was an essential tool for democratization. And then 2014 happened, right? Like we all experienced in our recent elections with fake news and fake photographs. So she writes about kind of that dichotomy and what the fate of democracy is in Indonesia as represented by photographs. Another photographer I really love in the book is this woman named Rosa Verhoef, who was born of bicultural heritage. Her mother was Indonesian, her father was Dutch. She spent most of her life in the Netherlands. And she went back to try and photograph her life in Indonesia in her adulthood in this book called Kopi Susu, which translates as coffee with milk, which is also kind of Indonesian slang for somebody who's biracial. What I think is one of the most important chapters in the book was also one of the greatest educations I had as an editor. It was one of the most difficult chapters to produce. Through a series of contacts, I met this young performance artist who is Sino-Indonesian, so she's Chinese-Indonesian. Chinese have a very difficult plight in Indonesia. There's a lot of anti-Chinese racism in Indonesia to date. But she got a whole trove, like her grandfather owned this photo studio in Jakarta called Foto Istimewa, which basically means photographs for the people. It's just a portrait gallery. And she used these as a way to kind of like understand her identity as a Chinese Indonesian, and used these pictures from her grandfather's studio as a way to look at more contemporary Chinese Indonesian artists working in photography, which is what we're seeing on the right. While I was working on this project, so I mentioned in 2018, I got a grant to go over to Indonesia for like 5 or 6 weeks. And it was also in 2018, I got this email from this totally unexpected email from this woman at the Academy of Arts in Novi Sad, Serbia, asking me if I wanted to come out there for a few weeks and teach a workshop. And my partner is like, oh my God, this is like, you got an email from the dispossessed Crown Prince of Nigeria. Like, this is totally a scam. You shouldn't respond to it. And I thought she was right, but I figured I had nothing to lose in responding. She wasn't asking for my passport or anything like that. So I did, and it turned out to be one of the best things I've ever done. I went to Novi Sad in 2018 for 3 weeks and taught a workshop, which was a totally transformative experience for me and the students and the person that I worked with, this woman named Dubravka Lazic. We're looking at one of her pictures on the right. Prior to getting involved in this work in Indonesia, I was like a stay-at-home dad. So I photographed my kids a lot for years. And she saw these pictures in the archive at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And based on that, she felt this resonance with her work, and she invited me to come teach this workshop. So this is actually the first time I've ever put these two pictures together, these three pictures. So on the left are pictures I made. The picture on the right is something Dubravka was making around the same time. And I kept in close contact with Dubravka. I still do to date. I consider her my best friend. I consider her one of my best friends. And for years, we've texted each other almost every day. During the pandemic years, we did some collaborative work online, like curating some exhibitions. And so I continued to work with this program in Serbia. And then in 2023, I got a grant, just a small grant from the Community Arts Partnership of Tompkins County, and Dubravka got a small grant. And we put those resources together, and I went back to Novi Sad for 2.5 weeks about a year ago. And first, I'm just going to show you the pictures I made. Like, again, I took that strategy of, oftentimes I'll work on photographic projects for years. I also like working on photographic projects for a few weeks. So I put this little book together called Danube Dreams, where I was photographing along the Danube River, which flows right through Novi Sad, and making these little watercolors in the studio apartment I had. And I came back and I made this little zine by putting all these things together. And while I was in Novi Sad, I had this idea before I went to Novi Sad, but when I finished this big project in Indonesia, so in 2022, I published this book, right, The History of Photography in Indonesia. And I knew that I wanted to do another big multi-year book project. And I thought it was going to be in Indonesia. And I tried out a couple of things and they never really took root. But before going to visit Dubravka again, I said, maybe I should see if I can take the networking process or methodology that I learned doing this work in Indonesia and apply it to another region. And I talked to Dubravka about this a little bit before I left. He's like, oh, it's a good idea. We can talk about it when you're here. And the last night I was there, I was with a bunch of people from the Academy of Arts, and I talked about it. And everybody was like, yes, this is a great idea. So I had this idea originally that I was going to do kind of a book of essays about photography from Serbia. And when I got back to the States in April, I started finding ways to build a network and connect with people. So I started just using Zoom, interviewing curators in Belgrade and Zagreb. Well, originally I was just going to look at Serbia, but then the question of Yugoslavia hit me, right? So if you think back to the history of that region, Serbia became a country about the same time Indonesia got their independence. And prior to that, for the previous 50, almost 100 years, actually, it was part of Yugoslavia. And we all know how horrible that became in the 90s, right? But I quickly came to the realization that I didn't want to do something about Serbia, and I wanted to do something about the former Yugoslavia, the Western Balkans. And as I started doing these online interviews, it took on a life of its own. And I started meeting curators in Zagreb and Ljubljana and Belgrade and artists from all of these places. And I now have this idea that I'm going to put together a collection of essays. I've given the book kind of the working title, Something About You, spelled YU, the abbreviation of Yugoslavia. Something About You, Photography in the Western Balkans. When I first started this, I thought I was going to do it like what I did in Indonesia and work with other people to write the essays. But I feel in the last 5 or 6 years, writing's really become a much, much bigger part of my practice. And I now want to try and write the whole thing. I've written 3 essays already. The first was published with a really great photo journal in Brussels, Trigger. And it's about 2 photographers, one born in Serbia, one born in Croatia, both who kind of were college-age students when the wars broke out in the 1990s. I guess one was high school age, the other was college age. And they both left after the wars and found lives elsewhere in Europe, but also went back about 15 or 20 years after they left to try and specifically photograph Yugoslavia, not Croatia or Serbia. So the picture on the left is by a photographer named Olja Trijaška Stefanovic, who's from Serbia but now lives in Bratislava, Slovakia. The picture on the right is by Dragana Jurasic. What I love about this picture is this was actually made at the exact spot that Franz Josef was assassinated. This is where World War I started, photographed about 100 years after World War I. Another essay that I've written that I'm still working on getting published, I think it might work with a publisher based in Ljubljana, is about this photographer named Branko Lenart, who, he's pretty old, he's probably in his 70s now. It's been really fun to work with him because I've interviewed him several times, and this seems kind of like a legacy thing for him. But he in the early 70s, when he was a young photographer, he was part of a conference in Austria that brought John Jarkowski, Ralph Gibson, and Robert Heineken over. And they really liked this guy, Branko. So they invited him over to this region, to the Iperian workshops, where he became part of a documentary project on the Hudson Valley, pioneered by Peter Schlesinger, which you're seeing on the left. But what I think is more important is he found like this incredible strategy for documentary photography that he brought back to his homeland in Slovenia, which is what you're looking at on the right. So the essay that I wrote is mostly about his work in Slovenia, but also how he learned that approach to documentary studies here in the United States. I just finished this essay about Cooney Jansen, a Dutch photographer who photographed in Macedonia in the early 2000s. I have to say, like, speaking with her was like incredible. She's like one of my favorite human beings. Like, she's so sensitive and wise and relatable, and really incredible work. I assume a lot of you know her work. This is her second book. She's gone on to do work in South Africa, Japan, the United States, India. The essay I'm working on now, is about Lucia Moholy, Lassa Moholy-Naj's wife. I can't remember the exact dates off the top of my head right now. I'm still kind of in the reading research phase. But she was invited to Yugoslavia, probably after World War II. Originally, the idea was that she was going to make photographs to illustrate the famous Rebecca West novel, Black Lamb and Gray Falcon, about Yugoslavia. So I've given this working title, The Bauhaus in Yugoslavia, looking at Lucia Moholy's photographs. And I have a couple of other things in the works. Just recently, I submitted a proposal. 5 years ago, right before the COVID lockdown, I had this really great opportunity to work on a project with the United Nations, curating an exhibition about this initiative they were implementing to empower women in post-war conflict negotiations in Africa and the Middle East. And I'm trying to take the template that we used for that exhibition and recreate it as a workshop in Sarajevo. I've been collaborating, again, just through Zoom. I love Zoom. I hate it for work, but I love it for my work. But trying to take the ideas that I learned from this exhibition and bringing it to a workshop at the University of Sarajevo in Bosnia. I was recently awarded a really great residency in Croatia, in Split, Croatia, where I'm going to be working on 2 essays. I've been working or in conversations with this curator in Zagreb who specializes in conceptual photography from the 60s and 70s. So she's going to give me access to her archives, which is what we're looking at on the right. So I'm going to try and write an essay on the emergence of conceptual art in Ljubljana and Zagreb in the 1960s and 70s, and specifically the role of photography in that. And if you've read, really, I think they're great. Flawed in many ways, but I think they're great. The trilogy of books by Jerry Badger and Martin Parr. I thought I was reversing their names for a minute. There's a section in there that's about photo books of Chairman Mao. So I want to try and write an essay about photo books about President Tito and using archives in Croatia to help develop that. And I know I'm kind of pushing it on time, but I just have 2 more things I want to show you, and I'd be delighted to take questions. I think often when people give a talk like this, they talk about influences at the beginning. And I thought it'd be fun to try and change gears and talk about it at the end. I'm sure most of you know who we're looking at, right? Emmett and Edith Gowan. This was made about the time that Emmett was at RISD's, like just before, just after. He sent it to me like 6 months ago or something. I can't remember the dates. But I had, like, right out of graduate school in 1998, I had this opportunity to work on a project with Emmett. And I had stars in my eyes. It's like, wow, Emmett Gowan's willing to work on this project with me. But like that conversation I had with Cooney Jansen, the first conversation I had with Emmett, like really moved me. It really changed things. And there's so much that I remember about it. There's one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, where he said, like, the key to being a good photographer is being open, right? That sounds really simple, and I've been trying to think for years, like, what he meant by that, like what openness means to me as a photographer. And if you know the great Philadelphia monograph by Emmett Gowan, he quotes Asphodel, the poem by William Carlos Williams in it, which has that lovely line, if nobody came to try it, the world would be the loser, right? So when Emmett told me that, I think that's part of what he meant, that you as a photographer have to be willing to go and engage the world. Like, you have to take the chances and make the mistakes to go be there, to do something substantive. But I also think that what he meant by openness is a willingness to be a conduit for what the world has to offer you. And I've often felt like when I was doing this work in Indonesia, as much as I was making it, I was facilitating it. Like, the audience was there, the resources were there, the contributors were there. It was just my job to make sure it made it to the finish line. And the way that I've been greeted by all these people in the Balkans makes me feel the same. It makes me feel like this is the right project and I'm the right person to do it. But again, like, I feel like it's happening with me rather than by me, if that distinction seems clear. And this is the last slide I have, but like, another artist that's been like a huge influence on me, especially in recent years, is Harry Smith, right? Totally eccentric guy. There's a show of his work at the Whitney a couple years ago. He's most well known for his experimental films and this anthology of music he released in the late 50s, early 60s, I'm bad with dates. But this like record like changed like music in the United States, right? Like Bob Dylan, John Baez, they said this was what made them write the music they became famous for. But what I love about Harry Smith is he is able to kind of bridge the ideas or the work of an artist and an ethnographer. And in fact, I don't think Harry Smith saw them as being anything different. Right? I think what he found both in making his work and in creating these kind of ethnographies, this ethnomusicological collection of American folk music, is I think what he's doing is looking for new ways of being, right? And I think that's so much of what drove me to Indonesia, but has also helped me connect with people in the Balkans recently. What you're looking at on the right is actually Harry Smith is on the left. He was about 16 or 17 years old when he started his anthropological work. He grew up in a small island off the coast of Washington State and started doing ethnographic work of the natives that were there. And apparently, like, the native communities completely shut out the West, but they liked Harry Smith and they invited him in. Harry went on to study anthropology at the University of Berkeley. When he got there, his professors, at that time esteemed anthropologists, said as a 16-year-old, he was doing master's quality work in anthropology. But to me, what Harry Smith represents is that mixing of art and anthropology, not as separate disciplines, but as one. And that's where I'm going to leave it. And I would love questions if you have them. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about the status of women photographers in Indonesia. I know you mentioned
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So when I put that work together for the Johnson Museum, I did like make a point of including one woman in that exhibition, but that was pretty hard to do at that time. It's a super kind of male-dominated field. So this photographer that I mentioned earlier on the right, Wimo Ambalabayang, like, artist collectives are a really big thing in Indonesia, and it kind of goes back to independence, right? You can get government money if you were an artist collective right after Indonesia became independent. So he belongs to this really, really influential photo collective called Mess 56. And they're often called the Mess Boys, right? Like it's a super, super kind of testosterone-laden situation. But I would say that's changed a lot in the last 5 to 8 years, and there actually are now women working in this collective. But when I first started doing this, in academia, and like the dean of the art school in Yogyakarta, when I was lecturing there in 2014, was a woman. But it was really hard to see women exhibited in galleries and there and whatnot there. But I think in some ways, photography, like photographic education, as I said, started there like in the mid-90s. It's totally caught like wildfire, and it's all over the place now. And I think because of its pervasiveness, it's actually become a way to facilitate more women in the art world over there. Yeah.
You mentioned that you're trying to take to replicate our workshop that you did for the United Nations in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that workshop?
Yeah, so, yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked that. So the workshop that I didn't do a workshop with the United Nations. So the Canadian government paid for this initiative within the United Nations to educate women in kind of negotiation tactics and things like that. And while they were teaching these workshops, mostly in Mali, the Congo, Cyprus, and Lebanon, I think were the countries I saw pictures from, they had like staff photographers and they had people taking notes and doing interviews with women involved. They gave me all these materials and I had to make an exhibition from it. And as you can kind of see on the right, like the finished exhibition were kind of these text image pieces where you'd have these portraits of the women with fragments of the interviews and statements they had made about being part of these workshops. The workshop that we're talking about in Bosnia is more based on the look of that exhibition as well as the content of that exhibition rather than the work that I did for the United Nations. I didn't do a workshop with the United Nations. I just processed materials they had. What we're trying to do in Sarajevo, this woman who's, technically she's a philosophy professor at the University of Sarajevo. She also runs this NGO called the Peace Hub, where she works with like high school teachers and college teachers about teaching peace, like in kind of the post-traumatic genocide of Bosnia. So we're going to try and bring students in to make pictures or work with archival pictures and make like really succinct statements that will become part of an exhibition. If the whole thing comes through, the exhibition will be both in Sarajevo and Ithaca. So yeah, the workshop is more modeled on the products we made from that collaboration with the UN rather than the work I did with them. Yeah.
A little bit of a naive question, I think, but I'm curious about your sense of whether there's a kind of distinctive photographic syntax, specifically in Indonesia. I mean, I know so little about it that I almost can't form the question in terms of like whether the influences of the practitioners there are primarily like or like, you know, I just feel like I'm just very curious about kind of photographic language there.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So when I was there in 2011, I met several photographers from this collective, Mess 56. And actually, this guy, Wimo Ambalabayong, wrote one of the essays that's in the history book. And the work that these photographers made, like, I'll be honest and say it took me a little while to learn to like, because like it had nothing to do with like anything I had been educated to understand as good photography. And like kind of once I crossed that bridge, it's like, oh my God, like these people are so lucky. They have no, like I was taught like what good photographs look like, and they weren't, they didn't give a shit what good photographs looked like. In fact, in the essay that Wimo contributed to this book, like when he When he looks at Kasian Chepas's photographs, he doesn't see a Javanese photographer. He sees a Javanese person photographing like a European. And he didn't want that. He completely rejected that. But I think part of what has happened like with social media and the mainstreaming of photography is you're seeing much more kind of conventional, kind of traditional photographic work emerging out of Indonesia. But I actually really like, when I met the MES56 photographers, I really came to love the freedom, like the just incredible disregard of what photographs were supposed to look like. And I think oftentimes, and I think this was pretty deliberate, like if you study kind of the history of photography in America and the West, Western Europe, like there are huge overlaps with performance art and conceptual art and video art. But photography is able to maintain a distinct lineage without those things. I think as photography hit the fine art world in Indonesia, it only did so because they started to accept photographs as documentation of performance art or video installation. So I think a lot of the first generation, like the work that was happening in the early 2000s, was really like performance art for the camera in a lot of ways. I don't think that's necessarily true in the work that I shared here, but I have the catalog from that exhibition if you want to see it. Like the MES56 photographers were very, very performative. And one of the things I really loved about this photographer, Henry Chusnapit Sunargo, is he's really the only like really classical photographer who was in that exhibition. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it depends on when. I would say like the last 5 to 6 years, I haven't played any music at all. Like I'll tinker around a little bit on drums I have around the house, but like I only do that a few times a month at this point, which at times kind of depresses me, but other times like it was totally a decision. And yeah, like for a long time, that was my primary connection to Indonesia. And I played with several different gamelans in the United States and Indonesia. And as I said, like so much of the work I was doing like with NGOs and nonprofits looking at Indonesia was really just to gain access to that. And but I also think perhaps more importantly, if you go back to where I started this whole thing, like that idea kind of like of art and religiosity. For me, for a long time, like I kept my photography separate. That was kind of my art. But playing music was a way to kind of keep my finger on that pulse still and still feel connected to that other history that I still identified with. And you know, like for a long time, I was playing gamelan at Cornell. And I think ultimately the reason I quit, it was that like a lot of the people in the gamelan were people like me, but most of the people in the gamelan were students. So like every semester we started from scratch, and it got kind of frustrating after a while. Like I had at times played with like one of just 2 or 3 professional gamelans in the United States. Like, so we had like a repertoire and like really disciplined kind of production and stuff like that. And I think if I still had that, I would probably still be playing. But at the same time, like, I think I do way too much anyway, and I don't think I do any of it well enough, right? Like, it's hard for me to do the writing and the photography I'm doing. I don't need one more thing to do. But yeah, like, it was really a large part for me, just a way to keep connected with like this really, like that whole idea I learned in Bali, like of art and religiosity. Like, I still think of that as a huge part of the work that I make as a photographer. Like, there's work that I've made recently, like I make a lot of stuff, like some stuff really quick and cheap and dirty, some stuff that I'll spend years working on. But a lot of the work I've been doing recently has been like as a photographer, not as a writer, is really about Buddhism in my mind, actually. And gamelan was just a way to make that active for me for years. I will say, as part of follow-up to that, like, I still consider music part of my research, right? And I've gotten really obsessed with music from the Balkans. There's some really great stuff coming from Turkey, Greece, Croatia. Like I've gotten really into that stuff recently. Yeah. Yeah. So my daughter was born in 2004. And my son was born in 2007. So really between 2004 and probably about 2010, like I was teaching in Alfred, but I like 4 or 5 days a week, I was a stay-at-home dad. Like I was teaching art at a public art college. I couldn't afford daycare or anything like that. So I would just spend my days with them, photographing. And like I was really into experimental darkroom stuff. Like I was really into like a lot of toning and like photographic monoprinting. I'm still like a big kind of printmaking geek with the work I make as a photographer. But like all of it was really about seeing the world like, I mean, like anybody who's had kids, like that whole idea that like language is a new thing. It's like, holy crap, like it's really affecting. And it really does change the way that you as an adult look at the world. So really for those 6 years, I never left my house to photograph, but this is my house in a rain puddle. Yep. Yeah, I did go to Indonesia a couple of times between, but I'm sorry I cut you off. Well, yes and no. Like, actually the first time I went to Java was in 1998, months after the fall. And it was also like Zippergate, right? It was the whole Clinton fiasco. And I remember like when I was in Bali in 1992, like everybody's house had a picture of the president and the vice president. I'm so glad we don't have to do that, but it's probably coming. But like everybody had it in the house. And I remember like I was living with a host family for like a month or so when I was there. And I was like who are these people? And they're like, we don't want to talk about it. We don't talk about politics. And then I go back in 1998 and everybody like, I was taking a ferry from Bali to Java, and like I was like the one white guy on the ferry, and like everybody wanted to come talk to me about Clinton and Suharto. And like I went to Indonesia a couple of times, just for a few weeks those times, and really just kind of as a tourist. And I wasn't really engaged in kind of like a critical or historical investigation of it. So I can't really say too much more about it. But there was a pretty big gap between 1998 and 2014 in terms of how I experienced politics. But it is pretty fascinating. And I actually think there are incredible overlaps between the United States and Indonesia. Like if you put them on top of one another, they actually are a pretty similar size. So most of Indonesia's water. They have a pretty similar size. And I think both countries are constantly balancing conservative fundamentalism with liberal democracy. They might be doing it better right now than we are too. That's not saying much, but. I have a couple of the books I talked about tonight. Some of them are for sale, some of them are not for sale. But if you want to look at them and you can ask questions more informally. Thank you for listening.